Good evening, everyone. Charles Moscowitz live. Thank you for joining me Monday through Friday, 10 p.m. to 12 midnight. Welcome to the program. I'm expecting Clint Ehrlich shortly, who is a Russia expert. We're going to talk about the Ukraine situation, whether or not we are heading into, whether or not Russia will invade Ukraine. He's a visiting researcher inside Russia's foreign ministry at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He's been on television a few times. I think he worked for a while as an advisor to several presidents. And let's hope he signs on soon. Meanwhile, I want to, first of all, I really enjoyed being interviewed by Tom Jump, who is one of the internet's predominant atheists, a nice guy, even though I don't agree with him. And we discussed a cross-section of issues in terms of whether or not there is a God. And we also got into a bit about creationism versus the theory of evolution. And I think that Tom is going to join me next week. I sent him a note. He said he's interested because I just want to talk a little bit about how he developed his philosophy, his materialist, naturalist philosophy of life. He's very bright and he's very articulate, and it's a great dialogue having him on. I also have next Monday. I'm going to be joined by Michael Joseph, who is a Catholic historian, and we're going to be talking about different issues that the Catholic Church dealt with philosophically and theologically, especially in its early stages, particularly Gnosticism and Waldensianism. I guess that was or the Cathar movement, which were sort of heretic movements inside the Catholic Church. So I'm looking forward to that interview, and I've got some interesting things coming up. While I wait for Clint to sign on, and if he doesn't make it, then I'm going to reschedule. And I mean, that's how this thing goes, you know. When you do an internet show, you can actually, even though I like to try to be consistent about doing it at 10 p.m. Eastern time, I actually can do it anytime I want. It's an amazing thing, you know. And I also think I might, while, assuming I have anyone here, let me give out the phone number. I can take calls on this program. This is, if you happen to be listening live, you can call in and let's just see. And I can take a call just like any conventional talk show here. 617-396-4958 is the number. 617-396-4958. This is Open Lines. This is your chance to come on in and give me a thought. So let's share your opinions. You can take a shot at me proverbially if you'd like, but just feel free to come on down and join the program. We also have a chat line on the Rumble site. Rumble is sort of my flagship station, even though right now I am running live on YouTube. I sometimes do, sometimes don't. But I feel like tonight I'm not really discussing the verboten topics like the 2020 election and the January 6th incursion, and there's certain other subjects that are hot buttons for YouTube. You can't discuss transsexuals. You can't discuss transhumanism. They're a little touchy about child trafficking, apparently, and they don't. Of course, you can't talk about the pandemic explicitly or the vaccine. So, since those were not my topics tonight, well, what else is there to talk about, right? I decided to turn it on and let it roll, let it rip, as it were. So let's just see. Do I have Clint coming up? Let me just send a quick note. Monday, February. Yeah, that's right. Waiting for Clint. Okay. Waiting for Clint. Want them to know this. Let me just see. Yes. Okay. Anyway, while I'm here fumfering away, you are welcome to join the program if you happen to be listening live. 617-396-4958. I am disturbed by what I see going on with Joe Rogan, that he's having to bow and scrape and kowtow to this elitist establishment. And unfortunately, he seems to have caved in to their demands. And the result has been that they have removed 100 of his podcasts from Spotify. He has a counter offer apparently from Rumble, which is the flagship of my own show, great station. They're offering him $100 million to pay off his contract with Spotify and to pay him, and with the promises that there will be no censorship. And we'll see what happens. I actually hope that he maybe takes advantage of that, because we have to stand up to censorship. And Joe Rogan has become just a giant in the industry right now. His program has actually become a cultural phenomena. And if he don't do it, who will, to be blunt. He has gotten into, they're going through his enemies. And I think that is what I would suggest, the deep state, what President Trump called the deep state, what Steve Bannon, I think, more broadly called the administrative state. And to give a quick thumbnail on what that is, I mean, actually, I'm writing about this in my new book, which will be coming out hopefully in a few months. I'm doing a sequel to my sociology book, Sociology for Conservatives, where I talk about the administrative state and how it's influenced our society. What it is in a nutshell is an informal and unholy coalition between elements of the government and the public sector and the private sector, particularly big tech in this case, and big corporations and other friends. And with in a sense, the philosophical undergirding being foundations and nonprofits and and non-governmental organizations. And in my book, I'm getting into how that whole thing started. And in a sense, the benchmark of it was the election of 1912. So I'm going to be doing a little historical synopsis of how it is that this administrative state emerged in the United States, how the idea of it is one that is un-American. It runs contrary to our idea of self-government under a constitution and under a representative government where our elected representatives hold the sole plenary power to make law. And then if we don't like those laws, we have them removed by not electing them again. And also that they operate within the purview of a constitution. That has gradually slipped away, I would argue, and has been replaced by the administrative state, which now is really showing its fangs in terms of the censorship. If you don't play ball with the administrative state, you are going to be denounced as a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, although they seem to have replaced that now with a transphobe, and an anti-Semite. And it doesn't matter what you do, they'll find something on you to try to prove this. And if they can't find it, they'll make it up. And that's what Joe Rogan is now undergoing, because Joe Rogan he's got a huge following. I mean, I think he's got something like upwards of 10 million people following his podcast. And that's something that is beyond the control of this administrative state. Now, I'm not saying that they come in formally and control anything, but it's sort of an informal, what Whittaker Chambers in his seminal biography, Witness, referred to as a conspiracy of gentlemen. They think alike, they're powerful, they believe that they're on the right side, and they want to control as much of our life and as much of our destiny as they possibly can. And the basic of that, of course, is controlling the means of communication, as Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, and not to do so officially, but to do so informally. And the way they do it is by using the very weapons that I just outlined, those names, those which can destroy a person, by having them denounced. And now they're pretty open about having people literally removed. Joe Rogan apparently used the N-word in his in a couple of past podcasts. So you have these nerds going through the podcast with a fine-tooth comb. They're looking in a microscope, and they found this. He did so pretty much under the context that he was reading an article by someone else, or he was quoting someone else. Maybe he was quoting Mark Twain in Huckleberry Finn. I don't know. But either way, I mean, look, I don't condone his use of that word. But I think that everyone knows that even though he might have made an insulting comment and an offensive comment, he's got nothing against Black men and women. This is ridiculous. He's a former athlete. I think he was a wrestler. He was, a former sports announcer. I think he got his start in sports, where he would interview athletes, many of whom are Black, and they were his friends. I mean, it's ridiculous to suggest that he's got something against Black people if he used that word. If anything, quite the opposite. And by the way, we should note that Joe Rogan is no great conservative either. He's liberal. I mean, he's a supporter of Bernie Sanders. He's, so-called progressive. So this isn't even about that. It's his power that they're worried about. This whole issue is no longer even a left-right thing. It's this consolidation of power. And the very basic of that, or one of the basics, is to control what people hear and see and what they don't to the highest degree possible. That's why they censored President Trump. When he tweeted that he would not be attending the Biden inauguration, Twitter used that as an excuse to censor him, to have him removed, so he could not reach his upwards of 10 million followers. They probably had planned to do that for a long time, but that's what they did. And at the same time, they took down Parler, which was competing with Twitter at the time, and which has been disabled ever since. And they probably pulled down hundreds, if not thousands, of other conservative thinkers and commentators. We find out that they were shadow banning people and algorithming people for years before that, including my own little show on YouTube. It's not an accident that my show did not grow. And I was told by numerous people that this was not an accident, that in fact, I regularly was contacted by people who told me that they had subscribed to my YouTube channel, and then their subscription just disappeared. They just stopped getting my YouTube, so they looked in and they discovered that it was gone. They had to resubscribe. And that wasn't just an occasional thing. I had that happen enough times to conclude that this was something that was more than a trend. I mean, this was a deliberate thing. So if they're going to do that to my little tiny station, I heard Breitbart, Alex Marlowe say on the Breitbart program that Breitbart lost about a quarter of their followers after the election of Donald Trump. And Breitbart is a significant news site. They've got journalists in Israel and in Great Britain. They've got offices, they've got a staff. I mean, that's a pretty big going concern. So, this is the kind of censorship that's going on. And now they're going after Joe Rogan. I hope that Joe Rogan tells them, forget it. He's keeping his shows, even with the N-word, because he obviously didn't mean he doesn't like black people. And everyone knows that, black and white. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a lie. We have to stand up to this kind of tyranny. Again, I'm not endorsing, if they want to comb through my shows, and I have probably at least 500 or 600 shows, they're not going to find that I've ever used that word, okay? Because it's not my thing. I just don't do that. I think that he was doing it because he was, who knows why? He was trying to be hip or something, or he was, as I've heard, he was reading from some article. Either way, regardless, this is a horrendous violation of free speech. And if he doesn't stand up and take the heat, then we're going to be, we're going to really have a major loss. I will say that I'm optimistic in that I believe that the censorship has not worked. You have all these alternative stations. I only occasionally live stream on YouTube, but I mostly live stream on Rumble, which is my flagship station. And I also live stream simultaneously on about 10 other live stream sites. And I download the program to approximately 30 sites, or I download it to one site, and it goes out to about 30 sites. And, there's also Getter, which is going very well, and other conservative sites, BitChute, Gab, all of it. I'm on all of it, and I'm expanding. I collect these sites like some people collect stamps and coins. So, this makes me feel better, more optimistic that we are going to succeed in ensuring that we have free speech in this country. We are going to develop an alternative media that will be enduring, and it will be a positive and strong enough that we will not have what this deep state seems to dream about, which is public ownership, their ownership of all communication. It is not going to happen. So I just want to share those thoughts about Joe Rogan. I don't think that Clint will be coming on, so I'm going to contact him and see if I can reschedule. And since I don't see the phone lines lighting up here, I'm not going to stay on, but let me just give out the number one more time. 617-396-4958, 617-396-4958. And let me just see if I got a message here. No, he doesn't seem to. Wait a minute. Can I resend the link? Of course I can. Maybe he will come on. Sometimes these things can happen the way they should. All right, I have to, excuse me while I click away here and get the link together. And here it is. Let me send, and boom. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to stay on because it looks like we may get Clint Ehrlich after all. Do noon or 3 p.m. CT on Monday. Would that work? Let's see, 3 p.m. I'll look at this later. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so Tom Jump will be joining me next week, T-Jump, but it won't be at the usual time. And of course, doing an internet show, that means I can do that because I get to be on or not on anytime I want. It's one of the beauties of this thing. It's not, it's not like working at an old-fashioned radio station where when the train leaves, you have to be on it or you're in trouble. Anyway, so I'm getting into, while I wait for Clint, I am working on a sequel to my book, Sociology for Conservatives. I'm not going to say what the name of the book is because I could get it with YouTube, but you'll hear about it as I go. Okay, we got Clint Ehrlich. All right, so And we are joined by Clint Ehrlich. Clint, thank you for joining me this evening.
My pleasure.
Okay, so I've already done the introductions here. You have a background in as a Russia expert. You've served in Russia at various institutes. You've been an advisor to presidents of the United States. I'd like to talk about the obvious subject at hand.
That might be a slight overstatement.
Okay.
I advised someone who advised the president. So there was an intermediary there. I was not directly briefing the president.
Thanks for clarifying. Is Russia going to invade Ukraine?
I think that has yet to be decided, and that the diplomatic avenues that are being pursued right now by France and Germany will largely dictate Russia's actions. But people who tell you that there's no chance that Russia is going to invade, that this is all a bluff, are absolutely wrong. That the steps that we're seeing the Russian Federation take right now involve movements to prepare to deter NATO, to defend their own territory in Kaliningrad, for example, in the event of an invasion of Ukraine. And so these are really serious steps. They aren't bluffs, and this is one of the most dangerous times in the modern era for international relations.
It seems like it's the closest that Europe has moved since the Hitler-Stalin pact. You know, I mean, it really looks like that kind of a buildup. I've seen I've watched some European news sources and American, and you can see where Russia is building up on that border. And just as a strategic matter, I mean, it looks to me like if Russia wants to invade Ukraine, and I don't know why they would, but we could talk about that. But if they do, they're not going to have too much trouble going in there. I mean, I think they could, you know, you've got like 1,000-mile border, and it's like very porous and it's open, and they've got, you know, they're putting hardware on that border to an unprecedented degree. So just as a matter of strategy, do you think that that could happen? And if they do, what's going to happen? I mean, are they going to move in or what?
I think it could absolutely happen. There's several factors that have to be taken into account when we look at a potential invasion scenario. One is the geography of Ukraine and the deployment of Russian forces. Right now, they're configured where they could pursue a pincer maneuver towards Kiev, basically a classic military strategy in order to quickly seize Ukraine's capital if they wanted to go all in that way, so to speak. And so we're talking about forces that are not only deployed on Russia's border when we talk about the Russian Federation that's recognized by the United States, but also within Crimea, which the U.S. thinks of as part of Ukraine, but which of course Russia thinks of it as its sovereign territory, and then also Russian forces in Belarus. And so Ukraine is really effectively surrounded. There have been estimates, intelligence estimates that were leaked from a closed briefing to Congress, which estimated that in the event of a Russian invasion, Kiev would fall within 72 hours. I think that those estimates actually underestimate the capabilities of the Russians to some extent, because they claim that there would be a 2.5 to 1 casualty ratio in favor of Russia. And I think that with Russia's military modernization, it's likely that we'd actually see a casualty ratio that would favor the Russians significantly more than that, and that frankly, this could be something akin to the Gulf War, where you go in and you expect for this to be a fairly evenly matched contest because of the size of the army that's being attacked. You know, Saddam had a very large military, and today Ukraine has actually the largest military in Europe outside of Russia. But there's such a difference in the technological capabilities of the forces that are involved and the air assets that Russia has. I think the world could really be shocked by the outcome of a conflict.
Well, I mean, just strategically, it does seem that Ukraine is surrounded because Belarus seems to be somewhat supine to the Russians, and Crimea is actually under Russian de facto control, not to mention the Black Sea. But I mean, nevertheless, the Ukrainians seem to have a strong nationalist movement, and they seem to be willing to fight. I mean, why would Russia want to occupy Ukraine? It could become like a quagmire for them. It could become like Afghanistan.
I don't think that Russia does actually want to occupy Ukraine. In the event of an invasion, first of all, I should say there's a range of scenarios. So it's possible that a Russian military incursion might involve more limited military objectives, not taking Kiev, for example. I
Okay.
certainly don't think that the Russians are likely to take the west of Ukraine. That's territory that they simply have no interest in. It wasn't a historical part of the Russian Empire, and it's one where they would face the worst potential insurgency. But I think that it's unlikely, even in the east, that Russia would seek to hold all of the territory or to annex it. I think what's more likely in the event that Russia deploys forces is that they would seek to coerce the government in Kiev into being replaced by a government that would not pursue Ukrainian membership in NATO, and that is
Right.
the primary strategic interest that Russia is pursuing with this military buildup.
Now, it seems to me, and I'm just, I don't know the inside story here, but that Russia actually has a reasonable argument for not having Ukraine join NATO. I mean, that's like, NATO is an alliance that was set up to oppose the Soviet Union, still there, and that this is NATO basically aggressively moving into really Russia's backyard. It would be like Canada joining an enemy of the United States and moving military troops. Let's say Canada joined up with China, and they started moving Chinese military, towards Seattle. I can actually understand where Russia doesn't really, doesn't favor that. And I wonder, why is it that NATO is advocating that? It doesn't seem like a very, it seems like a very aggressive and provocative thing to do.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I would make 2 points. So the first of them is that this is essentially NATO sleepwalking. In 2008, when the Bucharest Declaration was made by NATO, saying that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members, France and Germany opposed it, and it was the Bush administration that really pushed to have Ukraine and Georgia added. Their intention at the time was to provide a membership action plan for Ukraine, which is basically the final step towards NATO membership. And France and Germany were not willing to go along with that. And so instead, there was this compromise where an amorphous declaration was made that at some unspecified point in the future, Ukraine would become a NATO member. And so the US has basically become wedded to that statement, even though it was really symbolic at the time, and there was really never any timeline taken into account for when this would happen. The Ukrainians themselves, including President Zelensky, have said, if the answer is no, if we're not going to have NATO membership,
Okay.
just tell us already. And frankly, I think that's what the United States should do. I would quickly make one other point, a second point, which is that the situation is worse than your analogy really conveys, because right now, the Ukrainians have an official military doctrine that they want to recover Crimea. And so if NATO adds Ukraine, then essentially all of NATO would be in a state of war with Russia, because it would be supporting a state that is trying to take away territory that Russia believes is its sovereign territory. And today, President Putin talked about Russia's willingness to use nuclear weapons to defend that territory.
Yeah, I mean, that to my way of thinking, that's a dispute that goes way back, probably hundreds of years. I mean, in terms of who controls Crimea, and the majority of the people of Crimea are Russian. I think they've had a plebiscite there, and they actually, the majority, I don't know, I mean, I don't know how honest it was, but they seem to support being a part of Russia. And also that Russia did invade Georgia right after there was that move toward NATO membership, where they carved out two small semi-autonomous states of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So, Russia is not messing around when it comes to watching NATO make these kinds of maneuvers. Not to mention the fact that I think the overthrow of Yanukovych, who was an elected leader, whether or not we liked him, whether or not he was honest, all that, he was still elected by the majority of people in Ukraine. There was a coup d'etat in 2014 where he was removed from office but by people that I think it's safe to say were backed by NATO and were backed by the European Union, and that they wanted maybe a more Western policy in Ukraine, which of course led to a chain reaction in Russia with the occupation of Crimea and the movement toward the Donbass region on the eastern border. So, it just, I think that it's kind of a broader question on both sides. There's an attempt in this country to demonize Russia, which I don't think is working. This is, the kind of typical truculent war talk that often precedes a conflict, but I don't think the American people have any appetite for it.
I don't think the American people do, and I think it's important to take into account Russia's perspective on both Georgia and Ukraine. So when you said that Russia invaded, I think that's a colorable characterization of what happened, but the Russians would take a different view. Their contention would be that the president of Georgia, Saakashvili, with the support of NATO, actually started shelling that breakaway republic, and that it was Russia that intervened with its peacekeepers in order to try to stabilize the situation. And it's Russia's contention that the purpose of their buildup today in Ukraine is to prevent a similar scenario. They contend that the Ukrainian military is still shelling the Donbass, that it's not complying with the terms of the Minsk agreement, which would have provided a ceasefire in that conflict. And so it's Russia's contention that what they want is simply a ceasefire so that military force is no longer being used in eastern Ukraine.
Right, and again, the Donbass region has been contested between Russia and Ukraine, probably going all the way back to the days of the Kievan Rus. I mean, this is not a new conflict. It goes back to hundreds of years. Now, in a way, the United States, I guess I don't want to use a term here other than establishment. They seem to be promoting the idea that we have to have a war and that we have to have a war against Russia. And if you have, for example, Tucker Carlson over at Fox News has tried to say, no, I don't think it's a good idea. He's being accused of being a Russian spy. I mean, is that really what this has come down to?
Tucker and I were both accused of being Russian spies after my segment on his show, and it really shows you the sort of McCarthyism that now exists. And it's interesting that it's coming from the left. These were the same people who not so long ago claimed that one of the worst chapters of American history was when screenwriters were blacklisted for supposedly being communist. But now they're doing the same thing, claiming that anyone who speaks out against neocon warmongering is a Russian agent. And it's really disturbing to see that kind of rhetoric inside the United States.
Well, I guess we saw 3 years of that when they basically claimed essentially that President Donald Trump was spying for Russia. I mean, that was a classic example of this sort of thing. And it just, I suppose it's an expression of how much power they actually have, which I don't think is as much as they may think, because a good percentage, and I want to be careful here because we're on YouTube, of the American people, and about 60% of those polled in Republican Party, believe that the election was not, let's just say, on the up and up. And I think with those kinds of numbers, this administration doesn't have that kind of legitimacy where they can go to a war, not to mention go to a war against Russia, which is insane. I mean, so anyway, what do you think?
I think that it's important to take into account the international perception of our election. Putting aside the question of what really happened inside the United States, universal mail-in balloting is viewed, at least in Russia, as essentially not a legitimate form of election. The Russians require photographic ID in order to vote, and they don't believe that we have free and fair elections. They believe that our elections are rigged. And so whether that's true or not, it's important to understand that the idea of America as a shining beacon on a hill, a city on a hill that would inspire the rest of the world with its example of democracy, has really been eroded. That's no longer the perception. And even the Russian people no longer believe that America is a democratic country. So putting aside again, whether the election was rigged or not, there is certainly an international perception to that effect.
Just for the YouTube censors, I'm not questioning who's president and vice president right now. That's not what we're doing here. You've simply noted, Clint, that the world is viewing this government in a certain way, which is not exactly from a position of strength. And for us to now rattle a saber at Russia, I mean, it just brings up questions. I mean, this is part of there's obviously that maybe they think there's some immediate political gain by doing this because it'll take attention off of other things. The popularity of this administration is very low, and there's an upcoming midterm election. Or maybe it's also part of this general establishment foreign policy that's been in place since World War I, which is, what described by historian Charles Austin Beard in the title of his book, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. It's another chance for the United States to engage in nation building and world, all sorts of senseless wars and carnage where not only Americans' lives are lost, but it just creates unnecessary dislocation elsewhere in the world.
And one of the important things to understand, and one of the things that I feel obligated to speak out about as someone who speaks Russian, is the contrast that exists between Vladimir Putin as a leader and our president, Joe Biden. Vladimir Putin, whether he's a nice man or not, whether he's really democratically elected or not, is a very impressive person. When he speaks, his command of the facts, his charisma, his essentially just his control of what the Russians would call a power vertical is not in question at all. And today, at least inside Russia, and I think also in certain corners of the United States, there's really questions about the extent to which there is still a power vertical in America. Do we really have a commander in chief who is fully capable of assessing a situation and making the correct strategic choices? We've seen gaffes from President Biden when he talked about a minor incursion and then tried to walk back his statements that really show that he's not operating at the highest level as a statesman today. And without that, we're really behind the Russians.
Right. And we're not even mentioning the debacle in Afghanistan, which was one of the stupidest defeats militarily in world history, if you look at it. Not that we shouldn't have gradually withdrawn from there, but the way it was done was appalling, and it was amateurish, to put it mildly. And I think that maybe Putin is looking at that. And by the way, Putin is, I think, even now, extremely popular in Russia. It's not, I mean, he's the polls show him very, very supported there. What about our allies in Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and some of the emerging Eastern European countries? Are they concerned about what's going on, or what is their position?
They're certainly concerned, and I understand their concern. My contention would be that we don't have an obligation to intervene in a non-NATO country just to reassure our NATO allies. And in all candor, I opposed NATO expansion. I don't think that it was a good idea to have added those states, but having done it, we can say, look, we're willing to defend you. I'm not saying that we necessarily need to roll back NATO and put US security guarantees into question, but it doesn't mean that we have to compromise our national interests and get involved in conflicts where we don't even have a security obligation to those countries. And that's sort of the narrative that's being pushed, that to reassure the allies that we have in NATO that we need to intervene in Ukraine. And I reject that argument wholesale.
Well, I mean, isn't it though technically true that we are obligated to defend NATO members?
We are obligated to defend NATO members, but Ukraine is not a NATO member.
What about the Baltic states? Are they members of NATO?
The Baltic states are members of NATO.
Are they at risk right now?
I mean, I think that it's reasonable for them to feel a heightened state of alertness, given the fact that there are conflicts that are now on the verge potentially of happening around them. But no, I don't believe that Russia has any intention of attacking any NATO members, nor do I think that Russia has any intention of attacking Sweden or Finland, which are non-NATO states as well.
Which brings the question, I mean, with if God forbid this does happen and the United States goes to war, and it looks like we are sending troops there now, is Germany and France and Britain going to be involved, or are they going to stand out and let the United States, get a bloody nose?
Britain is actually probably more hawkish than even the United States in this conflict. And so I would say that we have a sort of a divide within NATO where the UK and the United States are very much pushing an aggressive posture towards Russia, and France and Germany are the ones who are trying to put a break on the conflict. The real question, I don't think that we're going to get directly involved in a conventional war with Russia, but the leaks that we've seen from the Biden administration suggest that what they would be open to doing is setting up camps in the NATO states that border Ukraine. They would train forces there and then have them use NATO arms to attack Russians in cross-border raids. And I think it's a really dangerous idea because there's such an obvious potential for escalation, just like Cambodia was next to Vietnam, and there were cross-border raids that were being conducted there, and ultimately they culminated in the US bombing Cambodia. I think we could see the same thing with Russia bombing those camps if we go that far.
Oh, it would be very bad news for Poland and probably the Baltic states to have that kind of old-fashioned border conflict. Now, today, President Biden met with Olaf Scholz, the new Prime Minister of Germany. What do you think transpired there?
I think that the Germans are basically pushing the same message that Macron pushed when he met just now with Putin, which is that there needs to be a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. We saw a leaked version of the United States response to Russia's proposed treaty, and the terms that the United States was pushing were simply so hard that there was no chance that Russia would agree to them. And so if we're going to stave off this conflict, if we're going to find a diplomatic rather than a military solution, the United States really needs to give a little bit instead of just issuing counter ultimatums to Russia.
Okay. So, Clint, in a nutshell, Russia is amassing troops on the border. Ukraine is surrounded. What's going to happen?
I think that it's likely that the United States will continue down a path towards instigating the conflict. I haven't seen any signs that the Biden administration is willing to make the reasonable concessions, frankly, like just withdrawing that 2008 declaration about Ukraine joining NATO in order to stave off a conflict. And so I think that there will be military action taken, as terrifying as that is.
Okay. All right, Clint Ehrlich. Listen, I want to thank you very much for joining me this evening. An interesting talk. We should do it again.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Take care. All right, everybody. Good night. I shall return tomorrow at the usual time. Goodbye, everybody. Good night.